Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about caregiving, parenting, caring for kids in different ways, and the child debate within climate change. We talked earlier about working with kids and young people, which overlaps with parenting and caregiving, of course. And in this section, we're going to focus a bit more on what is sometimes called the child debate within climate change, which is essentially decisions around family planning because of various factors stemming from climate change. And at this point, we thought it would be useful to introduce this tool that's called the Wheel of Climate Emotions. This was developed by the Climate Mental Health Network. This can be used with any age group, of course, but we wanted to introduce it here as we've covered some heavy topics so far, and we will be continuing to do so for the rest of the presentation. So maybe at this point, you might want to take a pause as we get ready to talk about the child debate and note what emotions are coming up for you. Just seeing if there's any on there that you identify with right now or that you have at other times, maybe ones that you see in clients. There's a lot of different perspectives within this conversation, and we'll get Trevor to share a little bit on one.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here again, saying that these are part of larger discussions, and that there's a lot of very different and nuanced reasons about not having children. Many of them have to do with the fear of, obviously climate and what type of quality of life we'd be giving. Beyond this, there is some academic fields of study that touch not exactly on the climate area, but there's a broader field of philosophy called antinatalism. They really write books that are quite on the nose, so better to have never to have been, that kind of take more of a utilitarian approach to the idea of, that life is fundamentally more pain than happiness kind of idea. I don't want to summarize too much or editorialize too much on these theories, but just know that there is these debates going on in some academic settings as well, around this, but that this is often much more of a felt and experienced kind of one around the child debate, than sometimes these larger discussions of is it worth having human life at all.
Yeah, and going into this tricky conversation, I'd hope this would be obvious, but we're not going to tell you whether it is right or wrong to have kids in the climate crisis. And I also hope that you would not tell clients that or suggest one way or the other, but just to explore a little bit of what the perspectives are that are out there. We have some research now on the mental health impacts of climate change in tandem with reproductive decision making. So like the quote there says, climate change concerns were typically associated with less positive attitudes towards reproduction and a desire and or intent for fewer children or none at all. And there were many reasons given for this within this study. Things like environmental impacts of overpopulation, the reality of what the future of the planet will look like for younger generations and onwards, and concerns about the actual practices of parenting as climate emergencies become more widespread. And you might think of other reasons that you've heard from clients or others in your circles. Another study talks specifically about the impacts of climate change on reproductive health. So we know that climate has impacts on um, things like, sorry, I lost what I was reading, has impacts on fertility, fetal development, and obstetrical outcomes. So when we frame this as a child debate, it's not necessarily an absolute choice that people have. There are very real impacts on reproductive ability from the kind of weather events that we're living in, heat waves. And so the authors of this study describe climate change as a major threat to reproductive health, particularly for marginalized communities such as racialized or low-income populations. And like I mentioned at the top, part of the specialization of the clinic where I work is on infertility and pregnancy loss. And I don't see a lot of discussion of climate change within this area, but it is important to start considering infertility and perinatal loss as climate issues and be prepared to discuss that with clients as appropriate. And we know that issues of infertility and perinatal loss are likely to increase as pollution and emissions increase, and we are likely to have more clients dealing with their decision to have children being limited by climate change. So these are two books that might be alternatives to the antinatalist arguments and literature, and they both speak to how we can be responsible caregivers within a climate impacted world. Um, so they're talking about how do we have kids and do right by them rather than deciding point blank that not having children is the only ethical thing to do. So you might want to make note of these books for yourself or for clients. The first one, The Conceivable Future, is written by two activists and parents who saw the need for more honest conversations around the child debate. They started organizing informal conversations in their own communities on this topic, and then wrote this book, but they also have a guide on their website for how to host these kind of living room conversations yourself. And whether that's something you actually engage in, it is a really useful guide on having these kinds of conversations with clients or in your own circles. Another recommendation is Parenting on Earth, which is written by a moral philosopher, Elizabeth Cripps, and she brings the question of ethics to how to be a parent in the era of climate change. So the discussion around reproductive justice and climate has been increasing in prominence in the past few years. If you Google climate child debate, there's a lot of articles that come up a lot from The Guardian for some reason. They have put out very similar articles several times with lots of different opposing views. But there's kind of a thread of people who are deciding to have kids or not feeling shame, whether whatever the decision is, they are being shamed, told that they're doing things wrong. So you might be familiar with the fact that people who give birth or don't give birth are sometimes told that they're doing things wrong and that people are entitled to, give their opinion about the decisions that they're making. Um, and also being told that it's, an individual responsibility to stem the impacts of climate change or continue creating human beings into the future, whatever it is, that responsibility is often put on individuals. Um, so in an area that is already very heavy with judgment and shame, it seems like around climate, it's much easier to find a small enemy, like the quote says, people who have children or people who don't have children, rather than to face what seems often like an insurmountable enemy, the fossil fuel industry. And of course, any of us who have clients who are experiencing shame, we know how much of an impact that has on them. And just another quote here, this one's from The Conceivable Future, the book that I mentioned earlier. The individualist tale of correct choices follows the same dead-end logic that drives climate change in the first place and buries the real political meaning of the moment. By this logic, the correct answer is resignation and inward focus rather than collective political action and change making. So back to our wheel of climate emotions, checking in after talking about this topic. Maybe you have different emotions coming up now or different questions that relate to different emotions. And what we've talked about in this area with clients is anxiety, grief, shame. So thinking about what other ones you may have seen in your clients on climate generally, maybe about reproductive health more specifically. And in general, there can be a tendency to turn climate emotions inward, like was spoken about in that last quote. We feel that guilt, that shame, and anxiety rather than to, have the skills to let the emotions flow through us and use the spark of that emotion to engage in action. Um, and the people who are doing the polluting, the corporations that are doing the polluting, benefit from that stagnation, from that guilt, the shame, and anxiety. But if we can mobilize the force of those emotions into action, we become threatening to them. And this can be something to discuss with clients, depending on their level of political knowledge or engagement. But to kind of, remove some of that guilt and self-blame, what forces outside themselves are responsible for the emotions that they've taken on? What emotions do fossil fuel companies hope that we feel? And what emotional work can we do to ensure that we are grounded in our own emotions and acting from that place rather than from these emotions that are imposed on us by those in power? These are not easy questions, of course, but we are therapists. This is kind of our whole thing, difficult emotional questions. And climate change is no different. So maybe thinking about ways that you can organize collaboratively with clients so that they can create action that's aligned with their skill sets and interests while also processing stuck emotions and turning them more externally. Like Trevor was talking about, too much processing can tip the balance, too much action can tip the balance, making sure that both of those are involved and the distancing as well, the video games. Um, and again, like I said at the top, you already have a lot of these emotion processing skills as therapists or therapists in training, you're learning them. These are things you already know how to do. It's just bringing them to this specific topic.